laboratory.
Yeah.
Well, that's the wrong one. That's the one that I used to use when I was the director on that. I didn't realize it was that much of a great thing, but I'm pleased to hear that in your opinion. I'm not really sure why I'm included as one of the old guard, because in the program that was sent to me, the label says something, I can't really read it without my glasses, but it says something about 58/HM. Well, 58, I mean, geez, God, that was well into AERS, so I didn't know whether to be offended or, just let it go. The other thing that was sort of difficult about today is that it's always hard to follow somebody like Mel Carriger or Al Chestnut. And I had to, at the last minute, do some major revisions because they said some of the things that I was going to say. The other problem is that I had some very specific remarks to make about Dr. Cronin, but I don't like to say them in his absence. Honor demands that he be given a chance to reply, and since he's not here, and I don't think that the TV will reply. And with that, take the jacket off and do this as we used to do it in the good old days of AERS, even if it wasn't 58. Now, I was really shocked to hear Al Chestnut's reference to collecting driftwood on the beaches in order to keep themselves. And I was even going to throw one out at the usual story of tromping through 3 feet of snow for 5 miles. But I decided that one ridiculous statement does me even in a slightly more serious way. Have any of you ever thought, how did you get into the career of marine science? Was it an accident? Did you, as a senior in high school, very precocious type, or maybe even as late as a sophomore in university, set forth a basic, very carefully conceived plan where you would go into a career to do certain things and you would get the Nobel Prize if you were lucky in 16 years? Is that what you did? I didn't do that. Or did you do perhaps what I can do in reflecting, be reasonably certain happened? Was your introduction to the marine sciences a function of people? The people that you met along the trail that guided you subtly or otherwise into making a selection which brings you here today in the marine sciences. And I must say, for a long time as a professor here, I used to look out on this sea of faces and think to myself, the students are getting younger every year. Now I look out and I find that, with a few exceptions like, myself, a few others, even the researchers are getting younger every year. And there's something not quite right here. But the question is, how did we get into the realm and the careers of marine sciences? How did it begin for me? Now, 52 years ago, I realized that is in part before some of you were even born. But be that as it may, in the summer of 1946, I went to Towson Junior College. Career, I think I might have known what the word meant from looking it up in Webster's, but career, science I knew was some nebulous thing. I had heard about it during the Second World War, and I thought that nuclear energy had something to do with science. But as a freshman in college, oh, come off it. But in that first year, a guy named Mr. Compton Crook, and he didn't even have a doctorate. He didn't push me, he invited me to come in and help him in his record keeping with his hobby of bandying birds. Well, fine, I had some extra time, so I helped at the cook. And I began to get a feel for some of these things. In my sophomore year, my chemistry professor, now she was a PhD, which obviously made it different, but she was a chemist, you know, that's different. She invited me to be her lab assistant in introductory chemistry, which I had passed barely the year before. Then, at the end of my 2-year Associate of Arts effort at Towson, I went on to Western Maryland College up in Westminster, which some of you might know where it is. At one time, Western Maryland College used to play the University of Maryland in football, and I gather that on one occasion they even beat them, but that was a long time ago. Okay, I went to Western Maryland, and all of a sudden I was being exposed to other people and other ideas. There was a guy named Dr. Estuarine, who was the professor. And at some point, for some reason, he decided that I should do an honors study. And I did. And I still remember that it had to do with spermatogenesis in some dumb salamander. It was a vertebrate of all things. I think I'm right. Isn't that right, Mel? It was a vertebrate. And then there was a woman by the name of Anne O'Rourke, who was a young instructor at Western Maryland. And she started talking about things like graduate school and Duke University and other places like that, and careers and GREs, and I didn't know what Duke, where was Duke? I never heard of Duke University. I never heard of graduate record exams. I never heard of graduate school, a doctorate. Why would you want a doctorate? I was having enough trouble getting a BS. So, but the more she leaned on me, and I must tell you now that she did become my wife. 28 years, she was the person who was standing behind me, on occasion gently pushing, but not always. And she was one of the people who definitely was along my trail. But she did convince me that I should also consider an internship at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory in Solomon. So I went to the Atlas and I looked up Solomon. It was down there in the Pacific. Anne corrected me, and we got it down in Maryland. And I want you to know that for room and board, not even spending money, Dr. Cronin permitted me to have a summer, actually 2, at the Chesapeake Biological Lab. The horizons were broadening, and the people who were beginning to influence my life were becoming more numerous. There was a man that Mel will remember, and so will a few others. His name was Reginald Van Trump Truitt. He died a few years ago at about 93. He was a grand man, the grand man of Solomon's at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. And I noticed that somehow, even though he was a scientist, he managed to serve in a liaison position capacity with that bunch up in D.C. and that other crowd in Annapolis. I think they're known as bureaucrats. But I learned early on that there was some kind of a mysterious linkage there, and it had to do with money. So that was an early lesson from Reginald Van Trump Truitt. And then there was Jim Carpenter. Jim Carpenter was another one of these guys who had made the mistake. He was a chemist. He was a marine chemist. And I learned a little bit of chemistry, usually at the ping pong table. And I don't know how many of you have ever experienced a summer in the basement of the old CBL lab when the humidity is 106. I know that's not possible now. The temperature is perhaps 106, but playing ping pong down there with the best 8 out of 9 is really a chore. But you can learn some chemistry that way. And I began to wonder about these things. Then there was Romeo Mansuetti. He was a fish diver. And every night, when Jim and I were down there playing ping pong, he was up in his laboratory doing all sorts of detailed drawings of the fishes of the Chesapeake. I mean, accuracy par excellence. So that summer was very interesting. And then I went down to Duke. And why did I go to Duke? It's cut and dry. I could have gone to Hopkins, which would have been closer. I could have gone to Chicago, which was out that way someplace beyond the Indian Reserve. But Duke offered me $800 as a stipend to come down there and see if I might make it for graduate work. And $800, as indicated by Al, was a third of what he was making. So that's pretty good. Now, through Duke, again, the number of individuals expanded by the few. And all of a sudden I was being faced with concepts and hypotheses and all sorts of good things. And it gradually dawned on me, in the best tradition of the scientific method and the powers of observation, that there could be things learned from the people with whom I was associating. Some of the things that one might choose to put into one's personality were good. And then there were some occasionally that one wished to discard. It's the old story of accentuate positivity, eliminate the negative. That's what I began to find myself doing, almost unconsciously. On completion of my doctorate, where I was granted all the immunities and so forth pertaining thereunto, has anybody ever discovered what all those things are? I've read my diploma, I don't know, it must have been 25 years ago, and I don't know what all those things that I'm entitled to amount to. Maybe someday you can have a special seminar on that. Okay, but as I came back down to Beaufort, because I had been here as a graduate student, and I had a few loose ends, shall we say, that I wanted to tidy up. Well, that meant that I had to find some money, because in those days, Duke didn't pay research assistants and research associates. You found your own money. So that I did. And that expanded my horizons still further into Raleigh, for the center, I thought, of all knowledge next to Chapel Hill. I'm sorry. If I offended anybody out there, I know I offended somebody. And last night you did an admirable job on the basketball court, and tonight, Duke, I hope will do the same thing. But I began to learn about Raleigh and Washington. And about that time, the Office of Naval Research evolved. The National Science Foundation was born. And all sorts of things became available. About that time, I was invited to go to London, which I knew was over there someplace, for the 15th International Congress of Zoology. And I went, and I met a lot of British scientists and a lot of other scientists, and as a result of it, I found out that in 1959, and Don was there, there was to be the first International Congress of Oceanography. The Russians still call it oceanology, which I think is technically correct, but that's all right. We won't fight about that. So all of a sudden, I was meeting the people whose papers I had read for years. And I discovered that they were people. You know, they ate lunch. They would invite me to join them for lunch. And in the evening, they would occasionally even have a drink. And then, as the meetings progressed, they would say, John, why don't you come with us for dinner tonight? And I would find myself seated around the table with a scientist from Great Britain, France, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Soviet Union. God. And again, I noticed that they all had certain qualities. And in my best scientific techniques, I began to look more closely. Now, along the line, I made the mistake of applying or filing for the mayor of the town of Beaufort. And I only did it because I knew I could not possibly be elected. I was a member of the minority party, which many of the people in Beaufort at that time did not even know how to spell. I was a damn Yankee or a Yankee, depending on the week. And I was an academic, one of that, erudite, fuzzy things, doctor of fishes or crabs or whatever. But I thought, well, unfortunately, my hypothesis was wrong. And the news ad the week before elections was so negative and so nasty and so full of dirt that a lot of people who only knew that I wore a red tie, that's all, voted for me, and I wound up with a 2-to-1 majority. But it gave me 2 terms of working with people regardless of their age, their sex, their color, their origin, or their level of education. And it proved to be invaluable down the road, especially in working with some of my scientific colleagues, and you can interpret that, however you may wish. Then came the time when the horizons really opened up, and that was, first of all, the 1966 International Congress of Oceanology in Moscow, which I participated in, met a number of Soviet colleagues who would never get out of the country because of political reasons. And ONR then said to me, why don't you spend 2 years as a liaison scientist in biological oceanography in London? Why not? I paid better than Duke did, so I figured it was. And if you can believe it, I was paid to visit any oceanographic facilities anywhere in Europe and report in the open literature, none of this hanky-panky stuff. What were the facilities like? What were the research programs underway? And to what degree were they prepared to entertain U.S. scientists? And strangely enough, through a quirk of fate, India became part of Europe, and so did the Soviet Union. So I wound up carrying a red passport and a courtesy title as a naval officer all over the Soviet Union, Romania, Bulgaria. I had to stop off in Czechoslovakia, even though there's no marine sciences there, and I'll tell you about that someday. All of a sudden, people, I could ever include all of them. Some of them are here, and I won't embarrass most of them. For example, and do not interpret this as name dropping, many of the people who I will identify are now long gone. And the ones who aren't have already contributed more to my career and my life than I could ever ask for. But that's not what it's intended to do. Gene Cronin, my mentor that formative year, the summer of 1950 at Solomon. He was strict about a knowledge of the literature, and it won't surprise any of you that I was required to memorize the anatomy and histology of the male reproductive system of Kalanecki sapinus raspin by Louis Eugene Cronin in 1947. But seriously, Gene was a great mentor. He was patient, he was disciplined, he was dedicated to a proper design before you launched your experiment, and he was equally determined that accuracy would be the day. And then there was Bookie, C.G. Bookout. Some of you may remember Bookout. He was my major professor. He preceded me as the director of the Duke University Marine Laboratory. We published numerous things together. About all I can really say about Bookie is that he is the ultimate teacher and the ultimate scholar and gentleman. He's still with us at 91, but he doesn't participate too much anymore. Then there was a gentleman that you might not expect, Sidney R. Gallup. Sid was the program director for the then early days of the U.S. Office of Naval Research. And he had the unique capacity to identify, support young scientists all over the United States and even in parts of Europe. Now, it wasn't much. My first ONR grant was $6,500. It went a long way. Marie Labour, Decapod crustaceans of the Plymouth area in 1927. I met her in 1958, long after she had retired. But she continued to be dedicated to her line of research. And even then, she was continuing to work on the decapod larvae of the Plymouth area. Harold Barnabas, an excellent scientist, but he had never been elected as a fellow of the Royal Society, and he wrapped himself in a cloak of bitterness because of this lack of recognition, and it prevented him from communicating with most of us who were not into such things. And then his rival, Professor Dennis Crisp, fellow of the Royal Society, commander of the British Empire. He supported his students, but he maintained a rigorous attitude as to what they were expected to do, and he would not deviate. Professor Drosh of the University of Paris, if you can believe it, one man was responsible for all marine sciences in France, including 3 laboratories, and at any one time up to 95 graduate students. Ce n'est pas possible. Okay. A.P. Orr, a Scotsman at Milford, the old Scottish Marine Biological Laboratory. A sense of humor. And he and his colleague, Miss Marshall, some of you will remember Marshall and Orr, devoted their lives to a continuing study of all sorts of details on Calanus and Marcus. But they maintained a sense of humor and a concern for people. Gab, a French Jew, who in spite of the fact that he rarely met people, in part because he still had the tattoo numbered on his wrist from the Nazi concentration camps, was prepared to meet with me, and when he discovered that I could not speak much in the way of French, he was prepared to speak perfect English. And then one more, and that is two more. Milakovsky, Soviet, Russian, also Jewish. At a time when it was not necessarily politics, he taught himself English, and he communicated with hundreds of Western scientists. He gave me my little lapel button, which in case some of you may not have noticed, it's a sailing vessel, which is the wind indicator on top of the Admiralty building in St. Petersburg, at that time Leningrad, built in 1810, so it's Tsarist, not communist. When he gave it to me, he said, "I am free to give this to you, and I hope you will be free to wear it." There was the thought of the freedom that he would like to have enjoyed in his science, which he knew I enjoyed, and he was very envious. And then there was Bruno Battaglia, Professor Battaglia, University of Padua, director of the Marine Laboratory at Venice. A classical continental scientist in every sense. I sat with him one day with a bunch of Russians while he gave an impromptu 30-minute lecture on the history of freedom of scientific research in Europe. It was the sort of thing you would have given your right arm to have had on tape. So, what are the lessons that one can learn as you go through your career in the marine sciences? Sure, there are some which are purely scientific. And I'll summarize just a couple. Make every effort to define your scientific objectives and work to become and remain as well informed as possible on as many aspects as possible. Be determined to be dedicated, disciplined, and open to constructive criticism when it is offered as such. Be thankful for the freedom that you are permitted to have in your scientific research and in your communication with your colleagues. It's not that way everywhere. In your teaching, seek to make the most of your unequal opportunity to influence in a positive way the open minds of your students as well as your associates. And then, as far as people are concerned, early on, strive to recognize the attributes, qualities of your associates, your colleagues, and your friends, incorporating those into your own efforts which are desirable and eliminating those which you do not wish to have. Why is this important? The world is changing, as we all know. 52 years ago, when I got started on this trail, the world was opening up into a post-war situation. Granting agencies were making money available to almost any qualified individual to do research, basic as well as applied. It was possible at that point for one individual to pretty well command a particular topic and go and devote the better part of their career to that one topic, as Marshall and Orr did all of their lives. Now the situation has changed drastically. As you're well aware, the demand for research support far exceeds the supply. The proliferation of trained personnel frequently is greater than that of the demand. And with the expansion of our base of information and the tendency to specialize in ever-narrowing fields of focus, one individual cannot possibly continue to do significant research for any length of time alone. But of even greater importance is my final word. Scientists following the trend throughout the world today are becoming more and more dependent upon computers, email, internet, websites, the electronic communications of this world. And that's a fine trend. But there is an ever-present danger that we will unconsciously be drawn into a comfortable womb of electronic devices and forget that it is people, not the computers, that formulate ideas and make the difference. My long, long trail of 52 years has been a magnificent one and a most memorable one. Largely because along the trail there were people who cared and provided me with inspiration, support, and direction. Most of you will remember the song, "There's a Long, Long Trail Winding." All of you are at various points in that long, long trail of your own careers. And I can only hope that they will be as magnificent as mine has been, and that you will take advantage, in the best sense of the word, of the people who are there to help you along.